Hi, Stephanie.
Hey, Lili.
I am so honored and pleased to have this conversation with you about this book, which actually I have right here. Um, a signed author signed copy. I loved this book, and I am so glad that we're doing this book talk because it gives me a chance to really dig into it with you. I I just want to start. Well, I'll start by introducing you, Stephanie Malia Krauss, um, Senior Advisor to JFF.
I am, yeah.
Yes, Senior Advisor to me, wonderful longtime colleague, and I believe your bio will be on the website. But we are here to talk about your book, Making It, What Today's Kids Need for Tomorrow's World. So I read this as a parent, and I read it as a professional, and I loved it on both counts. I mean, I loved it. So comprehensive, so easy to read, so important. I feel like you wrote this really with the reader in mind. Sort of who's going to take this up, and how do we take all of this complex information and make it digestible? So it just 100% worked. So I want to start by just asking you to tell us about the book and what inspired you to write it.
Well, first, I have to say, like, hearing you praise the book is such a big deal for me. So, if folks are, if you're listening to this video, Lili is like the resident editor, dig into your papers, tell you what can be better, what can be stronger, like long genetic line of solid journalist, writer, editors. So, to get that kind of praise from you as a reader, I'm gonna let that soak in here for a second. And I know exactly. The book was, I think that you'll appreciate this because you and I both have experience on the front lines in schools and then a long road in national work where we've worked with folks in the field, but also been privy to these big conversations. And so for me, I've now been in national work going on a decade and off the front lines where I was running a school and an education nonprofit and a teacher before that. And I've been logging over the years the information and conversations that we're kind of freely invited into as folks who work for national organizations that God, I wish I had when I was on the front lines. And that real sort of dislocation between intuitively what I knew I needed to know or what wasn't right, but really not knowing where to go for the information I needed. And so for me, like hearing you speak into this as reading it as both a parent and a professional, this was a book that was kind of my love letter back to the front lines, like almost a decade into national work. Here's the information that sometimes doesn't trickle down that really impacts how we should be working with young people, how we should be raising our young people. And so the sweet spot is definitely if you're raising or working with a kid, if you care about a kid, if you're an educator, coach, counselor, parent. But I mean, I think we've had this conversation over the years so often the people who are in the work aren't in the conversations about the work, or the people who are impacted by the work aren't in these conversations. And so this book was an attempt to create that bridge.
I love that. I love that. So the book is in kind of two parts, and part one sort of talks about uh, the problem.
Yeah.
It was kind of an amazing the problem and the opportunity, I guess. It was kind of an amazing summary across multiple disciplines. I mean, you bring in brain science, you bring in child development, you bring in racial and class inequities, you bring in the future of work, you bring in what's happening with the economy, you bring in learning theory. It was just so comprehensive. And I found it incredibly accessible, but at the same time, pretty scary. So frankly, at the end of part one, I was really ready for the solutions. So can you just talk a little bit about part one and who you think the audience for that piece in particular is?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go back to the sort of hope for the book of like, how do we get the information the folks on the front lines really need? And one of the pieces that was most important for me for the first part of the book was the sort of affirming and confirming that, yes, in fact, things are quite different. And this is a different moment, and this is a different group of kids. And what do we know? So it breaks into kind of two sections, as you know. One is, who are these kids that are coming up? Who is tomorrow's workforce? How are they being wired and rewired by what's happening in their lives and where they are and the moment in time they're growing up in? And then what is that world that they're growing up in, and what can we forecast about it? So I think the highlights for folks to know, and just to know, as you said, it is definitely like a tour de force. So, you will get so much more detail digging in. Is today's kids are well known as digital natives, but lesser known as disruption natives, that their whole lives have really been bookended by these crises. So one of the things that I mentioned in the book, and thinking about like our boys and in our high school experience, is um, and it has stayed with me as a human since writing the book, and is like constantly on my mind, is that these high school kids, so if you're between 18 and 21, so transitioning into, right, sort of older adolescence, young adulthood, some for many graduating high school or transitioning into work, that their lives started right after 9/11, that kindergarten started in the middle of the Great Recession during the years that smartphones came out and smart technologies. And now they're entering adulthood, or, last stage adolescence, in the middle of COVID, in the middle of the economic crisis, in the middle of the racial uprisings. And to understand that these crises that have shaped our adulthood, but not defined our entire lives, have actually defined their entire lives, I think is really profound, right? And super important to consider. And so in the book, as you'll remember, like I sort of call out, okay, so what does that mean? So, on the one hand, God, these kids want stability and security. They want to know it's going to be okay. On the other hand, we could be raising the next generation, or the best generation, of activists and advocates for change. On the other side is, what is this world that they're growing up in? And so I break that into, it's the former fifth grade teacher in me. I alliterate too much, but at one point in the book writing, I had to call a communications person and say, how much alliteration is too much alliteration? But I sort of think about the world changing in three different ways. One is machines. So what actually is the role of technology? What are we seeing in the future of work and the present day workforce? Momentum, how fast actually are things changing? And the answer is like very fast, right? Like everything is faster. The overwhelm, the overload is a real thing. And then the third is markets, where JFF spends so much of its time, and so many Horizons attendees spend their time thinking, which is that actually this post-secondary marketplace is quite different from the sort of idea of college or career that so many of our high schools still hold on to, so many of our youth programs still hold on to. So I wanted to make sure to clear that up, that, what is kind of the new emerging social contract of how young people get opportunity in the US. So you're right, there are a lot of problems and opportunities. I think the one thing I'll point out, Lili, that's important, and it's the legacy, I think, of both of our careers, is that young people and their families deserve an honest appraisal of what's going on, and so do the people working with them. We often will talk about basic needs and surviving, or what it takes to thrive and succeed and advance, but there's this messy middle in between of like, the world is still unfair and unjust. It's still super complicated. Hard things are happening. And can we get a very honest roadmap of what that looks like? And so that was the hope of that part.
Well, it's extraordinary how you managed to capture that messy middle. so comprehensively and to make it clear. I mean, it's really extraordinary. I hope everybody who watches this is going to go get this book, because it was amazing to me. So let's turn to the solutions part. Can you talk a little bit about what you call the critical currencies, the 4 Cs, if you will, and why you think they're important for parents, educators, employers, what we should all be doing to prepare young people for the future?
Yeah, so spoiler alert, if you hate alliteration, the extent of it ended up being the 4 currencies, which are C's, and those 3 M's of how the world's changing. Okay, so I think we should step back here for a second in terms of the setup for the currencies. So at the end of the first section, what I name, and this is going to be familiar to so many Horizons attendees, so many JFF friends and partners, because this is a message we've been trying to get out, I think, for some time, which is historically the social contract in the US, how folks thought you get ahead or, advance in America. It's always been flawed and inequitable, but we've long held to it, right? And so it said, you go to high school, you graduate, you get a diploma. Then you go to a 4-year college, you get a degree. You figure out what you want to be when you grow up. You get a series of jobs and career sort of nudges forward that give you better pay, promotions, better opportunities. And eventually one day you retire with money in the bank and you leave things for your kids that is better than the life that you had. So what's happened, I think, as we think about the present workforce, today's world, and the future of work, is that not only is that inequitable and doesn't work for everyone, but now it rarely works for anyone, and it's just super outdated. And so I wanted to give, again, who is this for? So folks on the front lines, right? Young people, their families, their educators, coaches, counselors, workforce, caseworkers, benefits coordinators, all of those folks, and understanding that, and again, this will feel familiar to a lot of people, but that the way that opportunity actually works in America is that young people and adults enter this increasingly complex, inequitable marketplace, and every opportunity has a cost, whether it's learning or work. And historically, in the education and workforce development space, as you know, people have given a lot of value to 2 of the currencies, which is credentials and competencies. What skills do you have? And show me the degree. And what's problematic, and I'll flag it here for the purpose of a JFF conversation, is that that's not the only way that people purchase and get opportunity in America. And in fact, it's not even the most common. And what we often tell folks who are poor is, well, if you're just skilled enough, or if you just complete this program, this degree, just get to graduation, you'll be fine. And it's a farce. And so there are these other 2 ways that people purchase opportunity, which are connection, social capital, who you know, and cash. And so together, these 4 currencies, competencies, what can you do? Credentials, how do you show me what you're qualified for? Connections, who do you know and who knows you, including like brand power, right? So in my background, I originally did Teach for America. That has a social capital brand that helps me purchase opportunity. And then straight up hard cash, like life is expensive and people need money and kids need money. I think one of the things that's hopeful, you and I have spent so much of our career thinking about opportunity youth, thinking about the untapped workforce, who are folks who haven't completed their degree, is that the research actually shows that while it's very hard, if you're lower in one, you can compensate in the others. So, if you don't have, my older brother, Jamie, never got a high school diploma. He and I both dropped out of school. I got a GED, he didn't, but he became a prolific artist and comedian. And eventually his skill, his competencies, and his connections, who he knew, enabled him to move forward, right? To get things that didn't require the credential. It doesn't work every time, but I think it's important for us to know how those sort of adjust. And then from an equity perspective, so much of that's inherited. So cash and connections in particular, if you're white or wealthy, if you have other pieces of privilege in your background, your sort of bank account for the opportunity marketplace is already rather flush, and it's much harder for others to acquire what they need.
I love that you pulled all of these together, because usually we talk about these things, universal basic income or skills development. We talk about them in different terrains, and you pull it all together. And I love the way that you did that. So let's dig into the equity issues. So what do we need to be doing to enable all young people, and especially young people of color, young people from communities that have been systemically marginalized? What do we need to do? And let's think about, you speak to parents, educators, employers. I mean, there are a lot of audiences for this book. Can you talk a little bit about what we need to do?
Yeah. So I'm going to start with like what this book is and what it isn't, because this is a starter. Think of this as like the flint for the fire for folks who may not have a grounding in a particular area. So this book was written in a way that for those folks who have never explored issues of racial equity, justice, anti-racism, abolition, any of those pieces, it's a safe on-ramp into the conversation to say, here's the world, and here are these kids, and here are why these things matter. Oh, and please go further. And here are some of my favorite researchers and writers, right, on these topics. But for folks who've long been in the world of organizing and justice and equity work, that they would also see themselves. But I do think it's important to just point out that making it is not what are the ingredients to do the work of abolition, redesign, rebuild, systems work. One of the things I talk about at the end is that for us as adults, our job is to be currency builders, and that the role of a currency builder is a dual commitment. The first is I need to help young people navigate the world as it is and as it treats them based on who they are, where they live, what challenges they're facing, right? I'm living life as an Indigenous young person, someone who lives in a rural community, a Black boy. I'm living life with a mental health condition, a physical health condition, this limitation. I'm living life while I'm in the justice system, I'm in foster care, I'm experiencing homelessness. All of these pieces situate themselves and impact the kinds of currencies young people need and also the experiences they have. So that dual call for us as adults is navigating life as it is, that world that's still unfair and unequal and unjust, and then doing the work of partnering with young people to build that better world and that more equitable one. And I want to lay that out there because what you have in the book are really grounded tools and strategies and solutions for that world that is still unfair, but it doesn't take us away from a real responsibility to keep doing the work of designing more equitable systems and disinvesting or dismantling what is hurting or harming kids. So on the end of helping young people navigate, I actually think, what's really imperative for all of us is first, we've got to be educated on what the stakes are right now and what the realities are. And that's everything from, do we have a good grounding and understanding of what trauma and stress do? Of mental health? Are we trained in mental health first aid? Do we understand what happens to the brain during periods of scarcity? Because one piece is, how do you actually keep young people moving forward while times are hard during those really tough times, right? And one is their connection to their family. We talk about cash, like you can't divorce a kid from the household he's in. And if the household is struggling, the kid is struggling at some level. So that grounding in education is really important. And then I think the other piece is, again, this is kind of about like getting a decent life, like a good grounding. We have to stop, particularly on the side for folks who work with young people. So I want to deal with sort of young people and then people on the demand side, employers and higher ed. So on the side of youth development, education, workforce development for youth, we have to upgrade and update our picture of what the world actually requires and what adulthood requires. We cannot continue college and career readiness programs or high school programs that are preparing young people for a world that no longer exists. And we have a moral obligation to do that. And that includes some risky business, things I don't dig into in the book, like looking at the impact of climate and weather and transients and other big things. It was like my pulling in cash. It's controversial to pull it in, but if the goal is to prepare and educate and equip, we have to. On the other side, for employers and higher ed folks who maybe are listening to this because they're parents, but also like wondering, what's my role? We have to understand that tomorrow's students and tomorrow's workers are actually very different. This COVID kid generation, Gen Z, whatever you want to call them, they're going to require different supports and skills. And we have to be thinking about not just what do they need to work, but what do they need for their working life? Or what is the relationship between quality of life and quality of learning? And how do we match and kind of map our supports and services for that? Last thing on this piece that I'll mention that was striking to me and has really impacted, and this gets to your equity question in a deep way, my experience as a parent and a professional is that science has evolved enough that in America, most kids with the right resources, supports, and opportunities should, as a rule and not the exception, live a 100-year life. And what we know is if you are born Black, Indigenous, a person of color, if you are born into poverty, if you are born with multiple factors clustered together, right? You're a person of color and you're living in poverty and you're living in an under-resourced community, that brings down the life, not only life quality, livability, but also the actual number of years that you live. And so you've got places in the country where even though science says these kids should live a 100-year life, making it past the first quarter is questionable. And so I actually think the real conversation our field needs to be having is not college and career readiness or employability, but actually livability and longevity, right? And that shift changes a number of things.
So powerful. I just have to say, outside my house, there's a car that's got a horn that just keeps going off. So I keep putting myself on mute. So you brought up the COVID kid generation. I think was what the term you used, which is really right. Can you talk about how you think COVID impacted how we look at the necessary changes in our education and workforce systems? What impact has it had? How is it? I think you were about to drop the book when COVID hit, and then you had to do a little bit of rethinking, but it was so relevant, perhaps even more relevant.
Yeah.
Say something about this time that we're in.
So making it as one of the first books, I think, that came out on the market that actually talks about COVID. And I rewrote the preface at least 5 times because I would say, as I'm writing this is what's happening in the world. And then the world would change dramatically. And we had the summer and the uprisings. And so I would rewrite the preface as I'm writing this is what's happening in the world. And it just kept changing. But what was interesting was it sort of typified exactly what I was trying to say in the book, which is the world is changing rapidly. It's super volatile and disruptive, and kids can't stop growing and developing in the middle of it. They can't, like, they didn't ask to be born right now, and they can't hit the pause button and say, like, I actually want to do high school when things are a little bit easier, right? Or like, could I just stop for a couple of years and then like come back and try again? And so you have them going through these like major milestones. So I think, okay, so I think a number of things. One is, so there's like the optimistic part of me, then there's the pragmatist part of me, and then there's the pessimistic part of me. So optimistically, the book was super well received, and I don't think it was the actual book. I think it was the timing. I think that people who have not long
It might have been both. I'm just saying, but
oh yeah, it's supposed to be selling a book. Totally, the book was phenomenal. Go buy it. I'm so good at this. So the optimistic part of me thinks there are a number of us who have long been saying quality of life matters for learning, right? If life is not good, if life is challenging, if trauma is happening, if basic needs aren't met, kids are not going to learn optimally. Oh, and also learning can happen anytime and anywhere. Whenever it happens, it should count, you know, like it doesn't have to be brick and mortar, all of these pieces. And so the optimistic part of me says, we have seen those things bear out in powerful ways that they require a response. Everything from the limitations of online learning and where technology is helpful or harmful, to the role of mental and physical health in academic performance, to the deep disparities between where and how a kid is living and where and how they're learning, and what the difference can be, what happened when school shut down, and what was available for some kids or not for others. So those require a response, and I'm watching philanthropy retool in support of more whole child and holistic and comprehensive supports in support of mental health, project-based experiential learning, student-centered learning, right? Things we've got, you and I have long histories with. So that's a good thing. I think the pragmatist in me thinks about the old education theorist, David Tyek, where he talked about how resilient traditional education culture is and how hard it is to change it. And so practically, we saw a number of schools, even in this moment where the national community was saying, reimagine, retool, this is our moment, where they just stayed in crisis schooling for a year and a half. And they missed an 18-month opportunity to just experiment and innovate and do differently. And instead it was just reactive, right, for the whole time. And so practically, I think change is hard, and that it's going to require partnerships beyond the schoolhouse. So our way forward for real sustained change, if quality of life and learning are connected, and if mental health and social emotional health are connected to academic performance or employability, that's going to require a new kind of sort of network of partnerships that reinvigorates ideas like community schools or educator employer partnerships, or those kinds of things, but really says, you know, what are all of the spaces and places where residents learn and work, and how do we really take a new kind of place-based approach? How do we really think about our residents and the experience of living in this community? I think the pessimist in me, we were talking before we hit record about baseball game I took my kids to, and like the moment that they lifted the mask mandate, everyone took the masks off and went back, and there's an aggressive urgency and desire to go back to normal, even if normal didn't work, right? We're just tired. And so the pessimistic part of me worries that even if it's harmful, even if it holds some kids back, even if it gets some kids sick, that the masks come off, the moment you can go back into the brick and mortar school, the moment that you can go back to sort of camp as you imagined it, there's just this craving, even if it's not what's best, it's what's known, and that feels comfortable. So those are kind of the three parts of myself here.
Yeah, well, I just, to just bring it back to the more optimistic part, I think, years ago, JFF had an initiative led by our friend and colleague, Adria Steinberg, called From the Margins to the Mainstream. And we were looking at where are the places out there in the community, that where they're doing it right. And I think what we have seen in this last year is that there are places that have done exactly what you were talking about in terms of your more hopeful self. And there are places for us to look, and we got to figure out how to get our systems to learn from those places, because there's been amazing innovation. So we are coming on time here. I need to close with one final question for you, and that is, how are you feeling right now about the future of work and workplace equity? And where in particular do you think we need to kind of course correct as a country and as a set of communities?
Yeah, gosh, good question. I think that I wouldn't be myself if I didn't bring up a couple points with that question. One is we have a country within a country of workers who don't have the worker wages they need to get by and provide for their families. And they are parents of these kids and caretakers and cousins and aunts and uncles. And we need to do right by them. I think about the beginning of the pandemic and the rise to talk about these essential workers as heroes. And we've got to own that and really put efforts in to support the untapped workforce in America. I think that I want to encourage every single tech entrepreneur, employer, higher ed person who happened to turn on this video to think generatively about who tomorrow's workforce is and how we plan and design for them, because the possibility is they could have an 80-year working life. And that's a long time to work. And they will be the workers. And so I think when I think about the future of work and I think about these kids, the future of work is dependent on the well-being and well-becoming of these young people, and who they are. And we know that they are a more diverse group than ever, and that they face more challenges than ever. And so our approach to preparing them and supporting them in the workforce has to change as well. I think that we're also at a moment of reckoning where we need to understand that a working person has their job and their life, and that work absorbs a lot of that, and the need to attend to well-being of our workforce all of the time, right? So the last thing I'll say here is I think we've got to be generative and regenerative. We need to be thinking about how the decisions that we're making are not only not causing harm, but actually creating positive impact in the lives of the young people and their families that we're working with.
Wonderful. Well, Stephanie, thank you so much for writing this book. I will tell you, God's honest truth, I've already used it. I brought it into my work already, and I will continue to do so. And I feel like what we need is part two that digs even deeper into this, but it's an extraordinary book. Thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thanks, Lili.